Here it is, the new Apple M2 13-inch MacBook Pro. In a sense, everything has changed and nothing has changed at the very same time. There's a lot to talk about this machine, so let's jump right into it. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. If you're new, welcome. If you have already subscribed, thank you and welcome back. We're going to be talking about the new M2 chip, and we're going to see how it performs against many variety of M1 using pro photography, real world workflow, and also some video workflow as well. This will be jam-packed with information, so feel free to pause and so you can analyze the result yourself. And with this said, let's establish some facts. Based on my extensive M1 testing, the MacMini 13-inch MacBook Pro and also the 24-inch iMac perform really close to each other. In fact, in general, they are only a few seconds apart. I'm establishing this fact because I do not have a 13-inch MacBook Pro M1 in the studio to run tests at the moment. So what we're going to be using is the MacMini as the primary machine to do the comparison and seeing how this compares to the M1 chip. For this system, it's pretty much the base M2, 8 CPU, which are divided into 4 efficiency, 4 high performance, 10 GPU core. This is an upgrade from either the 7 or the 8 GPU in the M1, 8 gigabytes of RAM, which is not enough for pro workflow, but we're going to go with it because we want to see how it performs. And it has 256 gigabytes of SSD storage, which is not that much. And also the other thing about this SSD storage, well, it can be somewhat controversial, so we're going to talk about that. In addition, I have all these test systems. The M1 Ultra with 48 core, M1 Max 32 core GPU, and it comes in 2 varieties, 64 and 32 gigabytes of memory, 16-inch MacBook Pro, the base model, Mac Mini, of course, and also the MacBook Air M1, that is also the base model. So we're going to be comparing all of these. Now, I have a future system coming in, and that is pretty much a similar spec to this machine, just upgraded RAM to 16 gigabytes. So we're going to be doing a comparison side by side to see how that performs, and I'll have another video coming out soon. So if you haven't yet, subscribe and hit the bell so you can be notified when that video comes out. And with this in mind, one more thing I want to mention is that if you want to see the result for the Intel machines, I recommend going and looking at my previous video that I've done comparing the M1 platform to the Intel platform. I mean, up until the Mac Studio benchmarking, I have always included an Intel machine or multiple Intel machines, including the Mac Pro and also the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro. However, at this point in time, I feel that we are really deep into the Apple Silicon M1 cycle. In fact, we're starting the second cycle already, M2, and this is the reason why I'm isolating the result as of now to just only the Apple Silicon platform. And with this in mind, majority of the tests you're going to see in this video have been retested. This is the reason why it took me that much longer, because majority of the machine had to go through a clean install in order to get the best result possible, and I have to run all the tests again because there are updates in macOS and also the software. Since I have ran those extensive tests that you have seen in the past, and the result back then no longer matches with the result that we're getting with the current OS and the application today, so we have to rerun them all again. So this explains why everything took a little bit longer than I really wanted. And with that in mind, let's talk about impressions. I mean, I'll say this right now. What the heck just happened to this machine? It's not really quite the performer we were expecting or what I was expecting. I'm expecting this M2 to really be really great, but we're not really quite getting that. Let's take a look at this. But before we talk about all those things, the same thing that I talked about before, the lack of optimized app, well, this is still coming back to plague us. And I will show you in some of the apps the way how it's utilizing the machine performance and also the machine resources. Obviously, it hasn't been updated yet. And with the way how Apple is releasing new operating system pretty much on a yearly basis or a little bit over a yearly basis, it is a lot for developer to really catch up. By the time something new's come out, obviously the developer has to catch up and then something new would come out again. So we're always going to be in this lockstep. So let's hope that majority of these app developers are able to update their app fairly soon to take advantage of this. Starting with the design. It's pretty much just the exact same design. It's the only Apple laptop now that has a touch bar, and that's pretty much it. I will leave it at that. This is pretty much a machine that we would love to see just to test the performance of the M2. The ports on this machine, we're still using Thunderbolt 3. Obviously, it's not Thunderbolt 4, and the USB is still 3.1 Gen 2, so it hasn't been 3.2 Gen 2 or any of the newer ones yet. Nonetheless, it still works just fine, but this laptop also lacks a MagSafe connection, which the MacBook Air is getting and the MacBook Pro clearly already have. So something to think about there. This computer has a media engine built in, an encoder-decoder engine. And this is the one taken from the M1 Pro, M1 Max chip. Well, mostly the M1 Pro because it's pretty much taken from that one, put it onto this machine. We're going to see how that performs. Now, being that this is my channel, we have to talk about display. So, are there any display connections and calibration issues? Well, based on my test, no display connection issues so far, testing with multiple different displays. Unlike when the M1 launched in the beginning, there were a lot of issues because there are changes in the way how the graphic layering is working on the M1. Well, thank goodness, majority of those are kept, probably some tweaks here and there, but it still works just fine. Software calibration with Calibration and ArtIsRight devices works just fine using Calibration software, so you won't run into any issues. The built-in display can be calibrated without any issues, and to calibrate this, you would just have to watch my guide on how to calibrate Apple computer with a built-in display. Note that there are a difference between this display and the new XDR display that has a different reference mode. This display does not, so I will leave a link on how to calibrate this using ArtIsRight and Calibration software in the description below. Next up is hardware calibration with BenQ SW display. Tested this, recommend downloading 1.3.17, the latest release from BenQ website. However, there is no problem calibrating this M2 to a BenQ SW hardware calibrated display. Now, regarding a number of displays that this computer, this M2 can support, it's just really one external display. Because the M chip in general, just without the Pro, without the Max, without the Ultra, can technically only support two displays. Because you already have one built in, it can only support one additional external display. You can always add more display via Display Link. However, that's using software to drive displays and graphics. So in high performance or video playback application, I generally don't recommend using that. And also hardware calibration would not work with Display Link. I've also tested this laptop with BenQ EX3210U, which is a 4K 144Hz display, and it works just fine using a USB-C to a DisplayPort connection. I haven't yet tested this out on an HDMI connection, but if I can find a dongle that can support HDMI 2.1 or higher, I'm going to test it out and see if it can output 4K 144 on an HDMI. But granted, it has to be on a supported dongle, so we shall see if that's going to work or not. So the question that you may be wondering is that, should you get this one or should you get the new MacBook Air? And this is a really interesting question because it ultimately will depend on what you do. If you're a pro, and I have some tips at the end, this and the MacBook Air may not necessarily be the machine that you want to look at, but we're going to talk about that later on in this video. Just remember, if you get any of these, like for example, the MacBook Pro 13-inch, MacBook Air, any Apple computer for that matter at this point in time, is that the components are non-upgradable. So configure based on your future need. If you think you're going to need more SSD in the future, get that. If you think you're going to need more RAM in the future, get that. And one more caution about the RAM too is that yes, it is unified memory. It means it's really fast. It can instantly share the memory between GPU and CPU without any problems. However, if your app still requires memory and you multitask, 8 GB is not enough. And just because it is unified memory, it doesn't mean it's a magical unicorn memory that can just replicate itself or expand at will. So you're still going to need more memory. So configure the memory based on what you need. All right, now let's talk about SSD speed. I posted this on my, I would say like YouTube social per se, with a screenshot showing these two. And this is disappointing. Let me just put it out there right now. The first thing I noticed when I run this test was, well, I was trying to copy about 180 GB of test asset over to the machine from a NVMe external SSD. It was extremely slow. So when I ran the speed test, well, I found out that the speed is pretty much half of what you get even in the MacBook Air. I mean, how is this possible and why is this okay? So this is a 256 gigabyte model, and what Apple have done is rather than using two 128 gigabyte SSD in a RAID 0 configuration so that it runs really fast, or an Apple proprietary RAID for that matter, what they have done is gone with a singular chip. This is why we're seeing the performance decrease. Well, I'm not really happy about this. However, one of my followers mentioned that the 512 gigabyte model is using two 256 gigabyte modules, so that's running together in RAID 0 or Apple proprietary RAID, and you are getting the higher performance in that. So I'm glad that they haven't reduced the SSD performance throughout all the machine, but the fact that my M1 MacBook Air has a faster SSD read and write speed than this that is supposed to be the Pro machine, it's kind of questionable. I mean, I'm not sure if this is supply chain related or what's really going on, but nonetheless, it's something to be aware of. Now let's jump into our real-world application tests. Let's start with Lightroom Classic. So a couple things to note about Lightroom Classic is that everything has been retested with Lightroom Classic 11.4 running on macOS 12.4. Now, it took a little bit longer for me to run these tests too, because on some machines, I have the beta installed on it. That is the beta macOS. So I have macOS 12.5 beta running. And I will tell you right now, if you want to run a speed test, do not use the beta because it is definitely slower. So I ran on both beta and non-beta. Anyway, Lightroom Classic is not really a good program to be testing the M2 right now. And here are some of the reasons why, as you're about to see in the result. Let's start out with the 1000 file one-to-one preview in Lightroom Classic. This is using the same 1000 file that I have used for all of my previous M1 tests. So this is going to give us a result that we know is going to be consistent because every single group of 1000 files are going to perform differently based on the files itself. All right, so based on what we can see so far, this M2 is definitely faster by, I would say, around 6 minutes than the M1 MacMini. However, this is more so the outlier than the norm, as you're about to see. And obviously the MacBook Air did took a long time, but obviously because that computer does not have active cooling, meaning that it does not have a fan, whereas this MacBook Pro does have a fan in it. So when it gets hot, well, the fan can just turn on. On the MacBook Air, it can't. It can only throttle the performance of the chip back. Here's a result compared to the other machines. We can see right now that the M2 is nudging closer, I would say, to the M1 Pro, M1 Max. However, there is still a slight gap between them. And I would say that the performance of these are clustering a little bit closer together to the M1 series in general. Obviously, the M1 Pro, M1 Max cluster really closer together, and the M1 Ultra is obviously in a class of its own. Now, let's have a look at the export result and see how these 1000 file export. Based on this, you can see something that's a little bit different right now. I had to run two tests on this M2, one with the current Lightroom 11.4 and the other one with Lightroom Classic 11.3.1. And interestingly enough, 11.3.1 runs faster than the current 11.4. Now, there are some anomaly going on, which I will outline in a few slides, so you'll get to see that in a moment. However, right now, the M1 MacMini, it's the fastest when we're just comparing just the M1 and M2 machines, not the fancy M1 Pro, M1 Max, M1 Ultra. M2 right now, rolling back one version of Lightroom, took around 50% longer. If we go to the current version, it adds about another 8 minutes or so to the task. I'm not really sure what's happening, but this has a lot to do with optimization and the fact that the program does not understand how to send instructions to these cores, to these new chips. And that's one of the biggest problems we're going to run into with the M2 platform starting out. And obviously you can see the result from the MacBook Air there. I mean, obviously this performance on the MacBook Air M1, the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro are very similar to each other in the way how the glitch is happening and the things and the way how the program is behaving. Here it is compared to the rest, and amazingly enough, with this latest 11.4 version of Lightroom, Adobe did also add in GPU acceleration for exporting, so we're seeing the time reduce quite a bit. I mean, for example, my M1 Ultra, the export time is now reduced in half compared to what it was before. This is really an amazing performance feat in general. So that's always good. We can see though that the M1 MacMini is really performing really close to the 16-inch M1 Pro, the base model, which is somewhat surprising to me. And what is really most surprising is the M2 that's supposed to be clustered somewhere, I would say up in here, it's almost down at the very bottom of the chart. The only thing that kind of just it beats out is the M1 MacBook Air, which is expected that it would beat that out. So I then also ran a different test, and what I have done is compare the export result for Lightroom 11.4 and also the previous version of Lightroom Classic. And you can see, for example, the M1 Ultra, the time almost got cut in half for exporting because it is utilizing the GPU as well in 11.4. In the other tasks, for example, the M1 Max and M1 Pro, the time did definitely got cut in half. And the machine that benefits the most out of this GPU acceleration is the MacMini M1. However, this result is really not seen in the M2 or the M1 MacBook Air just yet. So we can see that right now. For instance, these two machines, the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro and the M1 MacBook Air, performs better in the previous version of Lightroom than the current version that's out on the market today. I mean, look at that number. It's just really ridiculous how long that bar is, and look at how much shorter that bar is. This is on the opposite end of what the other machines are doing. So a lot of very interesting finding with this version of Lightroom and how this performed. So this is the chart from Lightroom Classic Export. You can see that the GPU is barely being touched. It's not even being utilized that much at all. And these cores that you see saturated on the very top here, these are the high efficiency core, not performance, efficiency. All the while the performance core, as I'm about to mark with O's here, are barely being touched throughout majority of export. This also explains why the graph for the CPU usage is sitting below 75%. I mean, this is probably around like 65% or so where it is hovering. So it's not really utilizing the right component, the right resources in the machine. Now, contrast this to the M1 Mac Mini. We can see that the GPU peaked up right away at almost 100%. The CPU is going up and down a little, but it's peaking higher, close to 75. But what I like to see though is something that looks like this. The performance core all being utilized throughout. While some of the efficiency cores are being utilized as well, however, the high performance one is the one that I really wanted to go close to 100, and we're getting that on the Mac Mini M1. So obviously there's more optimization that Adobe will have to do on these apps. Now let's have a look at my usual HDR Merge. This is 9 Nikon D810 file, and merging this together, the timing between all these machines, I would say they're close enough together, not that far apart. It's only a few seconds, so it's not a big deal. If this is your workflow, I mean, go with any of these machines would do. However, what I will also point out is that the M2, this is running 11.4 by the way, does lag behind the Mac Mini M1 at this point in time. And by the way, this is more CPU power based and not so much RAM, so we don't have to worry about the 16GB RAM versus the 8GB so much in this test. Here it is compared to the rest of the machine. You can see that the spread is really close to each other, that I wouldn't even lose sleep over this. Now let's talk about the Panorama Merge. This is taking 14 Nikon D810 file, merging together into a 314 megapixel DNG. When we look at this right now, I mean, don't get the M2 yet, maybe, or not at all. Let me put it this way. I think that at this point in time, you're probably better off trying to find an M1 that is also a cheaper price, that you're going to get a performance that's pretty much better right now because the software has been optimized for it already, and be able to use that machine on day one without having to worry about my machine's not optimized. I mean, let me put it this way. The M1 MacBook Air with 8GB of RAM beat out this M2 by a good 2 minutes, and that took a long time already. I mean, this is just absolutely crazy. The fact that this is also a RAM-based task, so the more RAM you give it, the better it performs, which is also the reason why the Mac Mini M1 performs really well. But we can see the way how this spreads too with all the other machines. For example, M1 Ultra, M1 Max, and also M1 Pro. And you can start to see that as we go to different amount of cores, different amount of GPUs, and also different amount of RAMs, we start to get a different distribution in this graph. I'll be doing some more testing about this. I'll probably do a separate dedicated video on Lightroom Classic at some point in the future. So again, stay tuned for that. Now let's talk about just Lightroom. So Lightroom, this is a cloud version, is an okay test for this. Everything has been retested with Lightroom 5.4 running on macOS 12.4. So let's have a look at the export 1000 file result. What we can see right now is that the M2 performance is pretty much almost in line with M1 Mac Mini. The only thing that M1 Mac Mini has the upper hand on is the fact that it has 16 gigabytes of memory compared to the 8. And this is still performing pretty much within a hair of each other. So we're not really seeing that performance improvement between the M2 and M1 at the moment. Now, like I said, I'm getting a 16 gigabyte RAM machine in, so we're definitely going to be running that test as well. Obviously, when it comes to the Air, obviously passive cooling, things runs a little bit longer. This is normal, and this is pretty much how the spread is. So at one point in time, I remember doing these videos talking about the fact that Lightroom CC, Lightroom Cloud version, is exporting a lot better than Lightroom Classic. Well, now the tide has turned. Lightroom Classic is now beating out this Lightroom by a big leap, especially like in the M1 Ultra, for instance, 7 minutes, 55 seconds. I mean, these same files, the M1 Ultra, the one that I have, was able to get it down to around under 5 minutes. I mean, that is just really awesome. Now let's have a look at Capture One. Everything have been retested on version 15.3 running macOS 12.4 clean installation. This program happens to be a fairly good one to test the M2 chip out. Let's have a look at the import preview. Based on this, the M2 is coming out at the top. However, the performance, it's really not that much better. Obviously, the software is not optimized for the M2 yet. However, it is still beating out the M1 by around 2 minutes, which is surprising and also not surprising at the same time. I mean, there's more that Capture One can do to utilize the CPU for import tasks to render these much faster than they are. However, we're just going to leave it at this for now. And obviously it's faster than the M1 MacBook Air, which is something that we would expect. This is the result comparing it to the rest on the import preview. And as we can see, the Ultra is performing pretty much at the very top. However, the Ultra having double the amount of CPU cores for all these machines that I just drawn, the M1 Pro and M1 Max. I mean, I expect that bar to be in half, but we're not really quite getting that. So obviously more optimizations still need to be done even on the M1 platform, let alone the M2. When it comes to the M2, this is where it sits right now. It's pretty much within a hair length, I would say like around 3 minutes or so, close to the M1 Pro, but I mean, this is, again, all these are not optimized yet, so it's not necessarily the best way to look at the result at the moment. Now let's have a look at the export, which utilizes the GPU heavily on the system. As we can see from this chart, the M2 is definitely beating out the M1 Mac Mini. Having 2 more GPU cores, and it's supposed to be faster and more efficient, it's beating this out by 2 minutes unoptimized. I guess that's good, but I mean, again, having more GPU core, I would think this would run a lot faster. And again, as much as Capture One may be a good program to show how the M2 is performing, I mean, Capture One as a program in general is not necessarily optimized for CPU or GPU on any of these M1s just yet. It is running native, but it's not optimized. Here it is compared to the rest, and what we can see right now is that 48 GPU doesn't really do much on the M1 Ultra, so if you're just using Capture One, I would say don't spend the money unless you want to get access to more CPU on the system. When it comes to the M1 Max, these are the one with 32 GPU, they're performing about the same. The M1 Max right now, the optimal setting or the optimal max for Capture One is still 24 core GPU, because if I have one right now, it's going to perform really close. It probably lands somewhere in that dot right there, really close to the 32 core GPU M1 Max. So save your money, get the 24 core GPU. Now, when it comes to all the other rest, for instance, when it comes to the M2 compared to the M1 Pro that has 16 GPU, I mean, we're talking about 4 GPU difference, but the performance, it's not even close to each other. This is a 10-minute gap between that. And this is telling us that, yeah, even though it has the GPU, it has a number of cores, even though it doesn't reach quite the M1 Pro, the performance of it overall is still not at the Pro level just yet. Now let's have a look at Photoshop. For this, I am using Lloyd Chamber test, and I will leave a link to his website in the description below. The tests that I've ran from his are the Dig Lloyd Speed, medium, and also huge to test different file size out. And yes, there are other Photoshop benchmark out there. This is the one that I have been using for a long time. It's the one that works really well for me to gauge the performance of machines. So I'm going to stick with these tests for the time being. All right, let's have a look at Photoshop speed 70% RAM and bumping the RAM up to 90%, we can see the performance. It's pretty much within spec with all the other machines. Not any faster, not any slower. This is pretty much utilizing the CPU speed exclusively. Comparing this to the other machine in the lineup, well, pretty much this is what we would expect the spread to be. In general, these are all really close to each other, about like maybe about a second apart. It's not really a big deal. Now let's have a look at the Photoshop Medium, which is generating a 15.7 gigabyte file. This is a task that uses a lot of RAM and also CPU in combination. So at 70%, my MacBook Air M1 is beating out the M2 by close to 2 seconds. This is obviously something that we're not expecting. When we bump this up to 90% RAM, well, the M2 did gain the title back a little bit. However, if we take a look at these two, how long it takes to perform, compared to, for instance, the MacMini M1, it's almost double the amount of time. In fact, it is double the amount of time. So obviously something is going on. So what I have also found out, very similar to Lightroom Classic, is that this M2 and, for example, the MacBook Air M1, the programs are not really utilizing the CPU in the correct way, the system resource in the correct way. So based on what I've showed you earlier in Lightroom Classic, we're seeing that again being repeated in Photoshop on these two machines. Here's the result compared to the rest. Obviously, what we can see right now is the fact that the M1 Max and Ultra sits at the very top. The Mac Mini, though, the fact that it can almost perform, and it actually slightly outperformed the M1 Pro Base 16-inch MacBook Pro, I mean, in this test by around like a second or so. That's really impressive. And when we bump the RAM up, the result is the same. However, when it comes to these two, the M2 MacBook Pro and also the M1 MacBook Air right now, there is some optimization issue going on. Here's Photoshop Huge, and you can see that the M2 is taking pretty much double the amount of time that it takes the Mac Mini M1 to run the test. So obviously something, it's really going wrong here. And I think it comes down to the fact that the program does not really understand how to distribute the instruction set to the new chip. And this could be an optimization that comes from Apple first via the operating system. And there may be something that is released from Adobe as well to optimize this. But I mean, I'm not the software developer, but that's just based on what I'm seeing so far. This is also Photoshop Huge right now. You can see that the two machines that we're talking about of Target is performing like pretty much almost dead last, with this machine that's supposed to be faster than the M1 performing absolutely dead last on this chart right now. So obviously when it comes to something like this, having more RAM on the system is definitely going to help. You can see the RAM distribution. It goes from pretty much a lot of RAM to a lot less RAM, and we start to see the time increase as we decrease the RAM on our system. Let's have a look at Final Cut Pro, and we're about to close to finish this up already. So starting with H.264 export, remember that this computer, this M2, has a dedicated encoder-decoder engine that was taken from the M1 Pro and put into this computer. Here's the result of that using Final Cut Pro 10.6.3, which is the latest version right now as it is filming, and comparing the export result. What we can see is that the M2 is slightly slower by around 4 seconds compared to the M1. It's pretty much all within the same range. So obviously, I mean, I don't know why they tout the fact that there is an encoder-decoder engine, because we're not seeing the performance increase here. Here's the result compared to the other machines. Obviously, the encoder-decoder engine inside the base M1 Pro is still better. And when it comes to the Max and the Ultra, it has double the encoder engine. So you're getting much better performance. But when it comes to the Ultra, really, because it has double that of the M1 Max, or 4 engine total, we're really not seeing that performance increase. And this is probably not the task that would definitely increase those performance. I think that when you do ProRes, you're going to see more of that performance bump. HEVC timing, I mean, it is 10 seconds better, but this is within the same margin as the rest. This is probably what I would call within the margin of error, and it's not that much faster. Here it is compared to the rest of the machine lineup. And lastly, let's talk about ProRes 422. This is where it's supposed to shine, right? Well, kind of, not really. It performs second to the Mac Mini M1. So even Apple software is not optimized to take advantage of the hardware encoder-decoder engine, and this is Final Cut Pro, which is Apple native software. I'm not really sure where things have gone wrong with the M2 here. So these are kind of the results that we can see so far. So what are my thoughts, and what does this really mean or potentially mean for the MacBook Air M2? If the MacBook Pro M2 with the fan on the inside, it has active cooling, is performing really in a mixed bag like this on apps that are available on the market today, granted, yes, they are not optimized for it. How do you think the MacBook Air M2 is going to perform when it doesn't have an active fan to cool the chip down when it runs hot? It's going to throttle performance, and I don't really think right now that the MacBook Air M2 is going to perform better than this machine. I could be proven wrong entirely, and I would love for that to happen. However, I really don't think that is going to be the case. Now, here's some food for thought. This also doesn't really give Apple a lot of room for them to really go out and redesign this machine and charge more money, because if we bring this spec really close to the base 14-inch MacBook Pro right now, we're pretty much within $300 apart from those two machines. And if you're going to do something like that, I would say just save up the extra $300 and get a base 14-inch MacBook Pro that has a better screen, better chip, better thermal, larger battery. I mean, pretty much everything. It has a MagSafe connection. I would go with that machine rather than buying this one. So, I mean, if you're going to go and spec out this machine, just look at the next one up. Look at the 14-inch for the time being. And if you're a pro, I definitely do not recommend that you would probably get the MacBook Air or even the 13-inch MacBook Pro M2 at this point. I mean, if you want my advice, here's my thought. These 13-inch MacBook Pro M1s are now on the market, and many places are going through clearance or people are selling them used. Those would be the one that you may want to get, because the performance as of now is going to be much better than what this M2 can do. I'm sure to give this a few months, and hopefully it is only a few months, that this M2 is going to outshine the M1. But based on what we can see now at the price point and the form factor that we're getting, you're probably better off just getting the M1 for the time being. So anyway, I have one more machine coming in. That is the one with 16 gigabytes of memory. I'll be running a test. I'll be sharing you the results of this soon. So make sure you stay tuned to the channel for that. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new. And in art we trust.